Most people believe Eid al-Adha and Hajj were always inseparable. Sacrifice, pilgrimage, the Kaaba, Mina, Arafah, it feels like they were born together. But what if that's not true? What if Muslims were celebrating Eid al-Adha before they could even reach Mecca? Before Hajj was fully possible? Before the Kaaba was accessible? Before pilgrimage and sacrifice became one? Imagine celebrating the day of sacrifice while being locked away from the house of God itself. Why did that happen? How did Eid al-Adha begin before Hajj became fully established? And what does that reveal about faith, sacrifice, and the psychology of devotion? Because sometimes worship begins long before arrival. Imagine leaving everything behind. Your home, your memories, your family history, the streets where you grew up, even the graves of those you loved. This was not tourism. This was survival. When Prophet Muhammad left Mecca for Medina in the year 622 CE, it was not simply a migration. It was the painful birth of a new civilization. For years, the early Muslims had faced persecution in Mecca. They were mocked, tortured, boycotted, and forced into isolation. Faith had become expensive. Belief had become dangerous. Some were killed. Some were exiled. Some were asked to choose between Islam and everything they had ever known. And then came the Hijrah. The migration to Medina was not merely a change of geography. It was the beginning of identity. In Mecca, Muslims survived. In Medina, they would build. They would build a community. They would build laws. They would build families. They would build a future. But perhaps most importantly, they would build rituals. Because civilizations are not built only with walls. They are built with meaning. They are built with moments people gather around. They are built with sacred days that remind hearts who they are. The Muslims arriving in Medina were not just looking for safety. They were searching for belonging. And soon, one of the most powerful symbols of that belonging would emerge. Eid. But before Eid became what we know today, Medina already had celebrations. And that is where the story truly begins. When Prophet Muhammad entered Medina, he noticed something familiar. People were celebrating. They had two special days every year, days of joy, games, gatherings, and festivity. These were inherited from the time before Islam, from the age Muslims call Jahiliyyah, the period of ignorance before divine guidance reshaped society. Celebration itself was not the problem. Islam never came to erase joy, came to purify it. The Prophet asked them about these days, and they replied, "We used to celebrate them in the days of ignorance." Then came one of the most defining statements about Islamic identity. The Prophet said, "Indeed, Allah has replaced them for you with 2 days better than them, the day of al-Adha and the day of al-Fitr." This narration is recorded in Sunan Abi Dawud, Hadith 1134. Notice the language. He did not say, "Stop celebrating." He said, "Allah has replaced them." This is profound, because Islam does not reject human emotion. It redirects it. People need joy. People need festivals. People need moments when the soul breathes. But instead of celebrations built around habit, tribal custom, or empty entertainment, Islam gave celebrations built around worship, gratitude, and remembrance. Eid al-Fitr would come after Ramadan, the joy after restraint. Eid al-Adha would come with sacrifice, the joy after surrender. This was not just religious legislation. It was psychological transformation. The Muslim community was learning a new emotional language. Even happiness would now point toward God. Even celebration would carry meaning. And among those two sacred days, one carried an especially deep shadow from the past, the memory of Ibrahim, the father of surrender, the man who taught humanity what sacrifice truly means. And from that legacy, Eid al-Adha would be born. Most people today automatically connect Eid al-Adha with Hajj. They imagine pilgrims in white garments, standing on the plains of Arafah, moving through Mina, circling the Kaaba. But here is the untold truth. The first Muslims celebrated Eid al-Adha before they could even perform Hajj freely. Before the roads to Mecca were open, before the Kaaba was accessible, before pilgrimage became possible, there was sacrifice, there was Eid. In Medina, the Muslims were given the day of sacrifice as a living act of worship. Its roots stretched back to Prophet Ibrahim and his son Ismail, not merely as history, but as a spiritual inheritance. The story was already known: a father commanded by God, a son willing to submit, a knife stopped by mercy, a ram sent from heaven. But Eid al-Adha was never meant to be just a story people retold once a year. It was meant to become something they lived. The Quran gave this command in Surah Al-Kawthar: pray to your Lord and sacrifice. Short, direct, powerful, prayer and sacrifice, worship of the heart, worship of the hands. The Prophet himself practiced it. He offered sacrifice with his own hands. Authentic narrations in Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim mention that he sacrificed 2 healthy horned rams, mentioning the name of Allah as he did so. This was not symbolic theater. It was real blood, real generosity, real surrender. Eid al-Adha entered Muslim life not as a holiday, but as a test. What are you willing to release for the sake of God? Your wealth? Your comfort? Your pride? Your attachment? Because Ibrahim was never asked only for a son. He was asked for his deepest love. And every believer carries an Ismail inside them, something difficult to let go of, something they fear placing on the altar of faith. That is why sacrifice was established before Hajj. Because before you journey to the house of God, you must first confront the idols inside yourself. And yet, there was still something painfully incomplete. They had Eid, but they did not yet have Mecca. They had sacrifice, but they could not yet reach the Kaaba. And that absence mattered deeply. Imagine celebrating Eid al-Adha while being unable to see the Kaaba. Imagine remembering Ibrahim while being blocked from the very sanctuary he helped raise. This was the emotional reality of the early Muslims. Mecca was still under the control of Quraysh, the same people who had persecuted them, the same people who had driven them out, the same people who saw Islam not as faith but as threat. Returning was not simple. It was dangerous. Pilgrimage was not just spiritually restricted, it was politically impossible. Today, many people assume Hajj and Eid al-Adha always arrive together in perfect harmony. But history was slower than that. The heart often arrives before the road opens. The Muslims in Medina prayed, they sacrificed, they remembered Ibrahim, but they could not freely return to the Kaaba. Think about that longing, to face the direction of Mecca every single day in prayer, yet be unable to walk there, to know the sacred house exists, yet be denied entry. This is not just historical information. This is human psychology. Sometimes faith requires loving something from a distance. Sometimes devotion means honoring a place you cannot yet reach. Sometimes obedience begins before access. Even the Treaty of Hudaybiyah in 6 AH reflected this pain. The Muslims traveled intending Umrah, only to be stopped before entering Mecca. Imagine the heartbreak. So close, yet not allowed in. And still they obeyed. Still they trusted. Still they waited. Because Islam teaches something difficult. Not every sacred destination is reached immediately. Some doors open only after patience proves sincerity. And eventually, that door would open, not through anger, not through desperation, but through divine timing. And when it did, Eid al-Adha and Hajj would finally meet. Forever, the conquest of Mecca changed everything. The city that once expelled the believers now opened its gates. The Kaaba, the sacred house built by Ibrahim and Ismail, was no longer under the shadow of idolatry. It was restored to Tawhid, the worship of one God. This was not just political victory. It was spiritual homecoming. Years of longing had led here. Years of prayer had pointed here. Years of sacrifice had prepared hearts for this moment. Now Hajj could return to its true meaning. And with that, Eid al-Adha found its full physical connection to pilgrimage. The rituals became united. Arafah, Muzdalifah, Mina, the sacrifice, the day of Nar, the Eid prayer, all woven together. Pilgrims stood on the plains of Arafah on the 9th of Hijrah, seeking forgiveness and mercy. Then came the 10th, Eid al-Adha, the day of sacrifice. The remembrance of Ibrahim became embodied through movement, not just memory, ritual, not just symbolism, journey. And perhaps one of the most striking facts in Islamic history is this: Prophet Muhammad performed only one Hajj after Hijrah. Only one. It was in the 10th year after migration. Known as Hajj al-Wada, the farewell pilgrimage, his final Hajj, his final public teaching, his final gathering with the Ummah. More than 100,000 people accompanied him. And there, during that pilgrimage, Islam reached a visible completion. The rituals were no longer fragments. They were whole. Eid al-Adha and Hajj were now permanently linked. Not because they started together, but because history had finally caught up with revelation. That matters, because sometimes in life, meaning comes first, and access comes later. The Muslims learned sacrifice before arrival, submission before completion, faith before fulfillment, and maybe that is exactly how God intended it. So, did Muslims celebrate Eid al-Adha before Hajj? Yes, and that answer carries more wisdom than many realize. Because Eid al-Adha was never only about slaughtering animals. It was never just about meat distribution. It was never merely a ritual on a calendar. It began with identity. It began with displacement. It began with a people rebuilding themselves after loss. It began with replacing empty celebration with meaningful joy. It began with prayer. It began with sacrifice. And perhaps most beautifully, it began with longing. The early Muslims celebrated Eid while still separated from Mecca. They honored sacrifice before they could complete pilgrimage. They remembered Ibrahim before they could stand where he stood. That matters for us today, because many people are waiting for the perfect moment to become devoted. They think, I will pray when life becomes stable. I will return to God when my heart feels ready. I will become serious when I finally reach my destination. But Islam teaches the opposite. You begin before arrival. You sacrifice before certainty. You obey before understanding everything. You celebrate faith even while the road is still closed. Sometimes your Hajj is still far away. Sometimes your Kaaba feels unreachable. Sometimes life places sacred dreams just beyond your hands. But devotion does not wait for possession. It begins with direction. The Muslims of Medina taught us that. They prayed facing Mecca before entering it. They celebrated Eid before touching the Kaaba. They sacrificed before access. And maybe that is the deepest lesson of Eid al-Adha. Sometimes faith means loving what you still cannot hold. Sometimes worship means trusting what you cannot yet reach. Sometimes obedience means placing your Ismail on the altar long before you see the ram. And sometimes, the journey to God begins not when the gates open, but when the heart says yes. That is the untold beginning of Eid al-Adha. Not merely a festival, not merely a slaughter, but the story of people who learned how to belong to God before they arrived home.